Radio Merelli RD 198, 1958. This is the documentation of the experience of a hobby project, available in video and in written form, made with the hope that it could be helpful to others. But any comment that could help me to improve my practice is welcome and appreciated. The Radio Merelli RD 198 is a radio receiver with an included turntable, made in 1958 in Italy by Magneti Marelli. However, the turntable was a standard product made by LaSalle in the same period. The best documentation available for this radio is contained in the Technical Sales Service Information Bulletin number R 144. This model seems to have been made for enjoying it mostly as a turntable and as a receiver for the FM, because the reception of the medium wave band does not seem to be very sensitive, and because even though there are two bands for the short wave, they have a remarkably narrow width. Converting meters to hertz from the dial scale, the first shortwave band of this model seems to receive at most between 5,900 and 6,300 kHz, which would offer an interval of only 400 kHz. The second shortwave band available seems to receive only between 11.4 and 12.2 MHz and therefore an interval of 800 kHz. There is probably a technical reason, considering that the variable capacitor has two sections with significantly different capacitance, which is a method that was used on early receivers for only the medium wave band, but not for radios capable of receiving multiple bands. However, if this is what actually happened, there is very little excuse for such poor design. One should also know that the intermediate frequency transformers used in this radio model are particularly fragile, and redoing the IF alignment should be avoided unless absolutely necessary. This particular unit was already serviced before, and it was clear that the original filter capacitor C85 ended up shorting, destroying the final output transformer, which had to be replaced as well. Here is the evidence. The 40 microfarads section of the original filter capacitor can that was left in place is shorted. The process of repair or restoration starts necessarily from the extraction of the chassis out of the cabinet, then it continues with cleaning the surfaces as much as possible. This unit must have been kept in an environment with a dusty airflow because there is a layer of dirt on the chassis and other surfaces. Luckily, there wasn't a significant development of rust. An air blower is used first to remove the most superficial dust. Under the circumstances, respiratory protection is in order. The vacuum tubes are mapped on the chassis. They are removed and cleaned, making sure that their identification code would not get lost. The original knobs have no set screws. Unfortunately, in a previous repair, it must have been necessary to pry them out, which broke a small piece on one side of each of them. After removing the knobs, also the dial glass is removed and cleaned carefully. Unfortunately, The writings on the dial glass are very fragile and are now coming off even without messing with them. Between the dial glass and the dial lights there is a light diffuser, which is removed and cleaned. While cleaning, it is visible the projections of part of the dial scale. Probably the radio was kept for a long time where the sunlight could reach the diffuser through the dial glass, and this could be the reason for the fragile printings on it. The chassis surface, the components on top of it, and the wires are cleaned using alcohol and cotton balls or cotton swabs where necessary. Under the dirt, two important rusted stains emerge. They are first cleaned as much as possible, scratching them and using common detergents. Then they are treated with a gel rust remover product. One of the stains involved also one screw and the corresponding nut that hold the power transformer. They are treated against rust as well with the same product. The band selector keyboard is also cleaned, but only roughly so far. Only at the end will it be possible to do a more accurate job. The pilot lights should be removed, but one of them is stuck. The sockets have been wrapped into a small sheet of iron and then soldered in position. Finally, also the tone switch set is cleaned using alcohol, but it requires some extra attention because the button in the middle does not get disengaged easily. After the cleaning and fixing process, some Vaseline oil is used to lubricate the movement and to protect the contacts. It is not possible to clean the IF cans properly, leaving them in place. They are held on the board that has the components only by a spring on the top. However, the extraction must be done carefully, because the board could remain stuck to the aluminum can. Once the cans are removed, they can be cleaned with some fine steel wool and a metal polish. The residues are washed using alcohol. Unfortunately, with alcohol, the original writings are lost. The opening where the IF transformer board gets inserted is slightly enlarged with a small file. Before putting back the two springs, they are cleaned from most of the rust using a rust remover product. Putting the springs back in place may require various attempts and a lot of patience. Here is the original condition under the chassis. The pink double electrolytic capacitor is replacing the original filter can of the radio. The final output transformer, which is not original, is connected with electrical wires used back then for small appliances. They have not been soldered properly, and these two connections on the primary winding appear to be inverted, with the probable effect of inducing more hum to the loudspeakers. The electrical restoration starts, necessarily from the power supply. The original filter capacitor can, as well as its pink replacement, are removed. This radio was made for being powered with maximum 220 volts AC, while nowadays the mains in Europe provide 230 volts or even more. Therefore, in place of the original filter capacitor can a small box, hosting a few halogen light bulbs in parallel with themselves, but in series with the mains, are inserted to drop slightly the input voltage. The box is used also to host two fuses and the new replacement for the filter capacitors. The exact connection will be explained in another section about the schematics. With the occasion also the paper capacitors located on the tone shaping switch are replaced with new components. Here are the amendments in this early electrical restoration stage. The connections to the input voltage selector are simplified so that only the 220 volts input is used, and even trying to choose a different voltage that would have no effect. Even though it is not clearly visible from the picture, the new input power cord has 3 wires, and the external electrical ground is now connected to the chassis for safety concerns. So far, the chassis seems to be working, at least for the FM reception, although somehow intermittently, and for some faint AM stations. The electrical restoration proceeds further. With the occasion, 3 germanium diodes 1 and 270 are installed in parallel with the corresponding detection diodes of the tube ABC80 or 6T8 hiding under the tube socket. Unfortunately, there is a problem with the FM tuner. The tube socket for the 12AAT7 was not soldered properly by the factory, and the reception is intermittent. It is necessary to take off the shield, but for that there is a screw in a very inconvenient location that must be removed. Only by using a saw blade was that done. Also, other soldering points are suspect, and all of them are redone. The shield is put back in place, taking care of the internal insulation that is now loose. The screws are put back as well, except for the one that should be located in that impossible place. The FM tuner shield is removed again for observing the mechanism used, which appears frighteningly cheap, because it relies on a thin cord that would be very difficult to replace. The original schematics show a couple of variable inductors, but the aluminum plate that is moving above the coils operates instead as a variable capacitor of a very low value in parallel with the coils. Therefore, when the plate is completely above the coils, the capacitance is at maximum, and the tuned frequency should be the lowest. The plate has to make a very good contact with the brass bar in the middle corresponding to the ground connection. The movement is stopped at the bottom to avoid breaking the two cords. It is possible that in this unit the movement turns in reverse direction, for a reason that will be explained in a later section. Unfortunately, removing the shield, the tuner board becomes loose, and there is a good chance that the tuning cord gets unhooked, as happened on this occasion. While tampering with the FM tuner, the two dial cords went loose, and with the occasion it felt appropriate to put some new cord. The original Technical Sales Service Information Bulletin contains a clear representation of the correct installation of the two dial cords. On the left side it is visible that the tuning shaft controls the cord that moves the drum of the FM tuner. On the right side the FM tuner drum is connected to the variable capacitor with a separate cord. It is useful to remember that, in the unit under restoration, while turning the FM tuning drum clockwise, the capacitances over the two coils increase, while turning it counterclockwise they decrease. This accelerated clip shows an early successful attempt of installing the first dial cord, controlling the FM tuner drum. Unfortunately, the fishing wire used for the purpose slips on the tuning shaft, and it is necessary to add some heat shrink pipe to increase the friction. That required more attempts later with the first dial cord, but they have not been recorded. The other cord is installed like it was in this item before this restoration process, which is reversed, so that when the FM tuner is set for receiving the lower frequency, also the variable capacitor is fully meshed. Unfortunately, the FM tuner of this item seems to operate in reverse mode compared to the dial scale, and therefore also the AM bands are now reversed. The electrical restoration is finished, but no alignment is done because the radio is working and because the ferrite cores of the IF transformers and those of the antenna and oscillator sections are very fragile and seem to be stuck in their original position. Only the trimmer capacitors, those that appear on top of the chassis, are adjusted for the best reception of the medium wave band. Unfortunately, the two shortwave bands designed for this radio are very narrow, and only under the best propagation condition one or two stations can be received there.
No, loro prendono e separano e scompongono e riciclano. Uno spettacolo pirotecnico che vi farà iniziare. Posizione numero 13, ritroviamo azioni globali di martellanti, quindi che ho voglia di uscire da questa mattina.
The FM reception seems to work reasonably well, at least that is comforting. The turntable is suspended over 3 springs, held by eclipse. The eclipse located at the button beyond the springs should be removed in order to extract the turntable. Like any other surface of this unit, also the turntable is filthy. An oven degreaser is used for removing the dirt. The mechanical parts and the contacts are cleaned with alcohol. The stylus cartridge and the area around are cleaned with alcohol using a cotton swab and a very small paintbrush. The cartridge is tested connecting it to a bench amplifier. The turntable motor is suspended on grommets, and one of them is completely rotten and should be replaced. The turntable mat is cleaned with the same oven degreaser already used in this project. The turntable motor requires 160 volts AC, which is obtained from the primary winding of the power transformer. For practical reasons, the connection is redone with new wires, making it separable using automotive spade connectors. 3 wires are used because now the radio chassis is connected to the external electrical ground, and also the turntable chassis should be connected to ground, especially for the presence of a power switch that has exposed contacts right under the turntable platter. Once the connection is ready, the turntable is tested, but the motor does not move, and in fact it is necessary to remove it for cleaning it and putting new oil in the bearings. The usual oven degreaser and alcohol are employed for cleaning. New Vaseline oil is applied to all the moving parts, and then the motor is reassembled. This component, which is used for selecting the different disc rotation speeds, must be installed exactly at the right position on the motor shaft, and a few attempts will be necessary to find the correct height. With the occasion, the old protection around the motor windings is replaced with new thin cardboard. Once the motor is installed, one should verify that each platter rotation speed can be engaged correctly. If they don't, the motor should be removed again, and that speed selection shaft should be aligned differently on the motor shaft. It is time to try the turntable, but it came with just this small disc for children, which has the same layer of dirt, like everything else so far. It undergoes the same cleaning procedure. The sound comes somehow intermittently. Later, the connection with the stylus cartridge is cleaned and slightly strengthened, which fixes the issue. Under the platter there is a very dangerous switch with exposed contacts. It cannot be left as it is because nobody would think that that is directly connected to the mains. This cardboard cover is not a very elegant solution, but at least it reduces the risks, reminding of the danger that there is underneath. The unit under restoration must have been exposed to the sunlight regularly throughout the period of time in which it was operational. That turned the white frame in front of the cabinet into yellow and brown, but it also affected the printing on the dial glass, which is now peeling off in some places. This is the reproduction of the actual dial scale, obtained with the help of a small scanner. Unfortunately, it cannot be better focused. This is a personal redrawn version with all the sizes. This plan is also available with better resolution in the written documentation that comes along with this video. Originally, the dial glass had some cloth tape to avoid touching directly the metal brackets that hold it in place. The old tape was removed and something else is used for the purpose. At the bottom it is some cardboard. At the top, some red electrical tape is used. that would also prevent the chassis from getting connected with the horizontal brass in front of the cabinet. The dial pointer is installed. The diffuser is put back in place. The dial glass is installed again. It is still the original one. The band selector keyboard is checked to verify if the dial glass is correctly installed. The Magic Eye requires some extra attention. The resistor, R65, is open, and that prevents any action on the eye. The chassis is tested again, and the functionality of the Magic Eye is now satisfactory.
O un messaggio WhatsApp o Telegram al sei dei miei slanci. È sempre lì. Festeggiamo 30 anni sempre più aspetti. Festeggi con noi questo gran finale. Gesù. Per qualche giorno. Anzi di Natale dei Grazie, benedetto.
In the cabinet, the Magic Eye tube is located in a very tight space, and it is advisable to insulate the socket to prevent major damages caused by shorts to the chassis ground. The cabinet contains two panels that have been attached using screws, but even removing all of them, it is not possible to completely extract those panels because of other wooden parts inserted later and glued to the cabinet. After various useless attempts of removing the speakers panel, only the speakers are removed, leaving the panel in place. By the way, it is interesting to observe that the two speakers in series are similar in size, but they are different for some reason, and they are original. The small brass decoration frames appearing on the front panel are removed. They are held in place by staples inserted in the wood, which must be extracted. The brass handle in front of the turntable lid is also removed. Removing the brass bar is a struggle because the screws on the side are covered by the speaker's panel, which cannot be removed and can hardly be tilted. Unfortunately, under the circumstances of this particular cabinet, the frame in front of it cannot be removed. After having masked the wood around it, the brass frame is cleaned using first a metal polish product that would be washed later with a mild detergent, then fine steel wool and cotton balls. Also, the plastic frame is cleaned with a detergent, cotton balls, and even steel wool. The face of the cabinet must have been exposed to sunlight for quite some time, and it is not possible to bring back the original ivory color. The brass bar has two inserts that are used to hold it to the speaker's panel. They are removed before cleaning the bar. The white color is flaking off and should be removed. The last residues are cleaned using acetone. All the brass components are cleaned using a metal polish product that later is washed out using alcohol or acetone. Unfortunately, there remain darker spots, therefore these parts will all be painted with a uniform gold color. The plastic frame on the front of the cabinet is partly loose and needs some glue. A long piece of veneer is peeling off and it must be glued. The turntable space is still filthy, and it requires a lot of attention, especially in the corners. The last pieces of brass are removed from the cabinet and then treated like the other already seen. The external finish of the cabinet is still in good shape, and it is just cleaned using the same degreaser already employed during all this restoration process. The lid of this cabinet had two white rubber stoppers, which in the meantime had completely deteriorated. The replacements are made out of two small pieces of pencil eraser. They should fit in the original holes on the lid. At the bottom of the cabinet there was a thin aluminum foil, used for shielding the bottom of the radio chassis. To replace that, a piece of thicker aluminum is cut and prepared with the holes necessary for the screws holding the chassis to the cabinet. Some hot glue leftovers are melted in the middle of this piece of aluminum to attach it to the cabinet. It will be easy to remove it if necessary. The crud on the knobs is so stubborn that degreaser, alcohol, acetone, and even aggressive metal polish are of no use. Only using mechanical methods is possible to remove this thick brown layer of dirt. The curling around the knobs requires a lot of attention for bringing it back to decency. For preserving the shine after cleaning, the curling is masked and then the knobs are sprayed with glossy clear lacquer. Reinstalling the horizontal brass bar is a struggle, as well as removing it, because it is partly covered by the speaker's panel, especially the place where the screws must be inserted. The two inserts are used to hold the bar also to the speaker's panel. However, inserting them in the brass bar is not an easy task. The screws of the speaker's panel have been removed before. Now new screws are inserted. The other brass decorations are inserted on the front panel, and they are fixed using hot glue instead of the original staples. Before reinstalling the loudspeakers, they are cleaned and a gel rust remover is used to get rid of the rust stains that they show. Also, the loudspeakers are now linked using spade connectors. For the loudspeakers on the right, more grommets are used underneath to make sure that it would not touch the wood panel directly with the metal basket. The brass handle is installed on the cabinet lid. The components of the support hinge for the lid are installed. The turntable is inserted on its hole suspended on 3 springs. There are 3 clips that push on the springs. Adjusting their position, it is possible to balance the turntable. This requires a few attempts. Other E-clips are used to lock the turntable on its suspension springs. The turntable seems to be correctly balanced, and it is possible to put the platter in its position together with the rubber mat. The chassis goes back in the cabinet. The screws holding the chassis at the bottom of the cabinet are type M3.5, which is not very common. One screw was missing. Therefore, new screws have been ordered and are on their way. The Magic Eye tube is better placed upside down, but it is necessary to make sure that the tip of the tube does not interfere with the tone shaping switching mechanism. In this case, the socket is warmed up so that the Heath shrink pipe used for the insulation becomes softer, and it takes the shape that is necessary to stay in that position. There is something that is worth observing in the schematic diagram of this radio. The antenna inputs for FM and AM are completely separate, which means that one could have installed a long AM antenna, but no signal could leak into the FM tuner. This choice can make sense considering that the radio includes an internal FM dipole. The schematic diagram does not tell what are the values of the variable capacitor for the AM bands. In the FM tuner module, there is the representation of two variable inductors, which is not accurate because the tuning is made varying the capacitance to ground above the inductors. The radio uses a regular isolation transformer for powering the B+ and the tube filaments, but the turntable is powered from the primary winding using the 160 volts tap, which means that it is not isolated from the mains. Unfortunately, the switch that activates the turntable is located right under the platter, and it has exposed contacts. One could get electrocuted, with lethal consequences just sticking one finger in one hole on the platter when that hole is right above the switch. This probably explains the reason for using a double power switch, but such measure would not be sufficient because very likely the radio would be powered while operating the turntable. As already mentioned in a previous section, considering that in Europe nowadays the mains provide about 230 volts, it was necessary to make an adaptation, to drop some voltage, and with the occasion also to have fuses. The voltage drop is obtained by putting 3 halogen light bulbs in parallel before reaching the power transformer. Using light bulbs instead of just a dropping resistor has the advantage that they would be able to control current surges while turning on the device or in case of internal failures. This choice also allows using fast-blowing fuses of low nominal current. Now, the chassis is connected to the external electrical ground, and one should make sure that that connection is effective. Here are the components that have been discarded. Also, all the screws removed from the cabinet have been replaced with new ones. The original filter capacitor can was removed to make room for the box containing the fuses, the halogen light bulbs, and the replacement electrolytic capacitors. For now, all the discarded components are kept. Here is a last view under the chassis after the restoration. The test is done in the evening using an indoor antenna, and it starts with the medium wave band.
score the way it is. In that first quarter for the Jets.
وقوات السماوات تتزعزع وحينئذ تظهر علامة ابن الإنسان في السماء وبهذا
The two shortwave bands cover a very narrow frequency range, and only occasionally it is possible to receive one station. During this test, nothing was received in those two bands. The FM band is the most satisfactory in this radio, and it relies on the internal antenna inside the cabinet.
Aria di famiglia.
Buon Mozart con grandissima maestria in un attimo trasforma queste bellissime note in qualcosa di magico, come al solito.
Come in un trattato del XV secolo di Antonio Cornazzano, il libro sull'arte del danzare.
Uno dei una danza che aveva un certo ritmo e quindi ballata, apprezzata anche dove abbiamo il tema, poi piva e poi il saltarello finale, quindi probabilmente c'è una sorta di suite anche.
A Catene e a Favaro Veneto e ora fino al 3 gennaio ammirabile Signum sarà esposto nel portico delle colonne dell'ospedale civile di Venezia. L'ultima tappa sarà il tempio votivo del Louvre.
Forza, tutti i Natali devono essere uguali, standard.
Music.
Siamo sempre alla ricerca delle migliori novità. Estrema attualità.
Sempre vergine, quindi diciamo su questo
Phono input.